Watch out for your daughter. My wife was wearing a sexy nightgown, revealing a large expanse of her fair skin. I pulled her into my arms, and her cheeks turned crimson. Just as we were about to take things further, the door creaked open slightly. I felt a gaze fixed on us. I quickly looked up at the door and met a pair of half-squinted eyes. The gaze was perverted, staring at my wife, who was scantily dressed. "Who is it?" I hurriedly stood up to check, but the eyes were gone. I asked my wife, "Did you see anyone outside just now?" She shook her head, looking confused. "Our daughter has already fallen asleep. It's impossible for anyone to be out there. I'm Shin Hao, an ordinary office worker. My daughter, Shin Fei, is 8 years old and very well behaved. My wife, Jiang Xiaoyu, is beautiful and virtuous. Although I don't have much money, I feel very content." That evening, while my wife was washing dishes in the kitchen, I suddenly hugged her from behind. "Baby, let us get intimate tonight." My wife squirmed. "Hey, be careful. Our daughter is still in the living room." I peeked toward the living room. My daughter was flipping through a fairy tale book on the sofa. "Fei can't see us from here, don't worry." I held my wife tighter. She nodded, her neck slightly reddening. I kissed her on the neck and teased, "Hee hee." Just then, I felt a gaze intensely staring at me. I quickly turned toward the living room. My daughter showed no signs of anything unusual and was still flipping through her book. I shook my head, maybe it was just an illusion. Later that night, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone while my wife went to tell our daughter a bedtime story and put her to sleep. About half an hour later, my wife opened the bedroom door, her eyes slightly squinted and a smile at her lips. She had changed into a sexy nightgown, exposing a large area of her fair skin. I immediately pulled her into my arms, and her cheeks flushed. Her red lips parted slightly. Just as we were about to take things further, I felt a gaze on me. I quickly looked up at the door and met a pair of half-squinted eyes. The gaze was incredibly lecherous, staring at my wife's barely covered body. "Who is it?" I muttered. I quickly stood up to check, but in the blink of an eye, the eyes were gone. I asked my wife, "Did you see anyone outside just now?" She grabbed the blanket, her voice trembling. "There's no one outside. Fei is sound asleep." I opened the door and walked around the living room. There was nothing outside. I gently opened my daughter's bedroom door. The sound of my daughter's steady breathing came from the bed. In my memory, my daughter always sleeps soundly and never wakes up in the middle of the night. It's strange. I clearly saw a pair of eyes just now. Besides my wife and me, the only other person in the house is our daughter. Who could those eyes belong to? I returned to the bedroom, where my wife was clutching the blanket. Was someone outside? I shook my head. It's nothing. I must have seen wrong. Fei is fast asleep. My wife sighed in relief. Are you stressed out at work lately? I smiled. Maybe. Let us get some rest early tonight. She turned to sleep. But I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, those strange eyes would appear in my mind. If it wasn't Fei, then who could it be? Could it be something sinister? Half awake, I felt a figure appear in front of me. The figure wasn't very tall, but I could never see its face, as though there was a translucent screen between us. I desperately wanted to get up and see who it was. But I couldn't move. In an instant, the figure held a pair of scissors, and in the next second, they were heading straight for my eyes. I couldn't move, not even to blink. I watched in horror as the scissors came closer and closer. Suddenly, a hideous face appeared right in front of me, a woman's face with bluish skin, her features distorted. Her eyes were all whites, no pupils, and her mouth was full of sharp fangs, drooling. I screamed, waking up suddenly. I opened my eyes and saw my daughter holding scissors, staring at me. "R." My daughter was startled by my scream. "Daddy, what's wrong? Daddy, wake up. Teach me how to cut paper." Her little face came into focus. She was holding a paper cutting book with one hand and a pair of scissors in the other. My wife walked in from outside. "What's all the shouting about?" I took a deep breath. "It's nothing. I just had a nightmare." My wife frowned slightly. "Honey, you've probably been too tired lately. You should rest more in the next few days." I nodded. Looking at my daughter's innocent face, I smiled and said, "Okay, after I get up, I'll teach our little angel how to cut paper." I got dressed and went to the living room. My wife had already brought out breakfast: fried eggs, bread and milk, and a plate of pickled vegetables. My daughter sat next to me and began eating eagerly. But something didn't feel quite right. The scissors my daughter had just placed on the table were small plastic children's scissors. But I clearly remembered that earlier, she had been holding a large steel pair of scissors by the bed. I glanced at my daughter. She looked up at me. "Daddy, why aren't you eating? Mommy's cooking is really good." Looking at her innocent face, I tried to convince myself that I must have just been too tired lately. I taught my daughter how to cut paper. She picked it up quickly, and in 10 minutes, she had cut out a giraffe. I gave her a thumbs up. "Feifei is amazing." She smiled and said, "Hee, it's because Daddy taught me well. Mommy doesn't know how to cut." At that moment, my wife walked over and gently pinched my daughter's little face. "Who's bad-mouthing me?" My daughter pointed at me. "It's Daddy." My wife looked at me, and I smiled back. My wife let go of her. "By the way, Feifei, it's time for your dance class." My daughter pouted. "Oh, can I skip it?" My wife took her hand. "No way. You're so good at dancing. How can we quit now?" A few minutes later, my wife and daughter left the house. I finished cleaning the dishes and was about to take a nap. Just as I was about to push open the bedroom door, I saw that my daughter's room was also open, and the desk was cluttered with papers and books. "Oh, this girl is great in every way, but she's a bit messy," I muttered as I walked into her room to tidy up the clutter on her desk. Thud, a notebook fell off the bookshelf. I turned and picked it up, about to put it back in the shelf. But I realized this notebook was unfamiliar. Its surface was pitch black, and I had never seen it before. I sat down on the chair and flipped through a few pages. The first pages were just my daughter's doodles, nothing out of the ordinary. But when I got to the fourth page, I saw a picture of a small child holding a pair of scissors, about to stab a woman lying on a bed. There were big words above it: "I hate Mom, I want to kill her." I gasped in shock. I kept turning the pages. The fifth page: "Mom hit me again, my butt hurts. She also whipped me with a rod, I'm scared." The sixth page: "Mom said she doesn't want me to go to school. She said she will lock me in the house, not give me food, and let me starve to death." The seventh page: "Mom pricked my arm with a needle, it hurts. She told me not to tell Dad." The eighth page: "Mom hits me when she drinks. She said if I die, she'd be happy." Each page had simple illustrations along with the words. My work requires frequent business trips, so I'm sometimes away from home for long periods. If Feifei is disobedient, even if I punish her, it shouldn't be like this, right? Since I met my wife, she has always been a gentle person. How could she abuse our child? Feifei is also a very obedient child. Though she has a little temper, she rarely lies. Looking at the terrifying words in the notebook, I carefully thought about any signs from my daughter and wife. But after thinking it over and over, I couldn't figure it out. At noon, my wife came home with our daughter. After changing her shoes, my daughter ran to the pile of toys to play. My wife changed into her slippers and said loudly, "Feifei, what's the first thing you should do when you get home?" My daughter fiddled with the building blocks in her hands, not answering. My wife walked over to her. "Feifei, go wash your hands quickly." My daughter smiled. "Okay, Mom, I'll wash them right away." I walked over to the sink. "Come on, Daddy will help you wash." My daughter stretched out her hand. "Mom says I'm a big girl now, I should do things myself." "It's fine, look at our little hands, how dirty they are," I said as I gently rolled up her sleeve. In that instant, I froze. There were several purple bruises on her once smooth, pale little arm. "Feifei, what happened to your arm?" I asked. My daughter quickly covered it with her sleeve. "Nothing, it's just chalk drawings I did while playing." She was clearly trying to hide something. My mind was filled with doubts. That night, after Feifei had fallen asleep, I asked my wife, "Honey, when I was washing Feifei's hands today, I saw some bruises on her arm." My wife looked up at me. "Really? What happened?" I looked into her eyes. "Feifei said she drew it with chalk, but it doesn't look like that to me." My wife yawned. "It must be Feifei playing with chalk. Remember, she drew a watch on your wrist before." Her expression was so natural, there wasn't even a hint of concealment. I also laughed. Kids these days are so naughty. If my wife were really abusing our daughter, she would definitely try to hide it. It's getting late, let us go to sleep, my wife said, turning off the lights and covering up with the blanket. Soon, she fell asleep, breathing evenly. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep, staring blankly at the ceiling. About half an hour later, I felt sleepy. In my daze, I felt the door crack open. The next morning, I woke up to find my wife was not in bed. I had a headache, even though I had slept for 8 hours. I checked the time, it was already 7:50. My wife came out of the kitchen. Honey, you're awake. I have to take Feifei to school now. I nodded, pressing my hand against my temple. You didn't sleep well yesterday. Why don't you sleep a bit more? You still have a few days off. My wife said as she took Feifei's hand and walked toward the door. Feifei smiled. Goodbye, Daddy. Feifei was wearing cropped pants today, and just as I looked up, I saw a bruise on her ankle. I hesitated for 2 seconds, then waved, be careful. Once I saw my wife and daughter leave. I quickly ate a couple of bites and went to Feifei's room. I wanted to find the notebook from yesterday in the bookshelf to see if there were any other clues. But I searched for a long time, flipping through from the first shelf to the third, and still couldn't find it. Had Feifei hidden the notebook? Just then, my phone rang. I quickly answered. Hello, who is this? A man's voice came on the line. Is this Mr. Shenhao? This is the district traffic police station. Yes, that's me. Well, your wife and daughter were in a car accident. A cold shiver ran through my body. My wife had just left not long ago. The phone clattered and fell to the floor. I could hear a voice on the other end, saying hello, hello. I quickly picked up the phone. My wife, my daughter, how are they? The voice replied, the ambulance has already arrived at the hospital, but the situation is unclear. Please come to the central hospital as soon as possible. I hung up the phone and ran out of the house like a maniac. I took a taxi straight to the central hospital. Luckily, the hospital wasn't too far from my home, and I arrived in 20 minutes. Outside the operating room, I saw my daughter. She was sitting on a chair next to the operating room, and there was a female police officer beside her. I immediately ran over and hugged her. Feifei, are you okay? I carefully looked at my daughter. Her face was a little blackened, and her hair was full of dust. As soon as my daughter saw me, she started crying. I'm fine, but Mom is still inside. Seeing that my daughter was okay, I stood up and looked toward the emergency room. Through the window, I saw my wife lying motionless on the bed inside. A steel bar-like rod was stuck in her leg. The doctors performing the surgery had blood on their hands. Thud. I collapsed to the ground. A pair of hands helped me up. You must be Mr. Shen, right? I nodded in confusion. At this moment, memories of my wife kept flashing before my eyes. Every time I came home, no matter how late, my wife would always wait for me to eat. I had gastroenteritis once, and when the pain was so bad I couldn't move, it was my wife who carried me to the car. Tears instantly filled my eyes. I grabbed the female police officer's hand. Is my wife okay? My hands were trembling. The female officer looked worried too. Your wife is in critical condition. Please stay calm. I snapped, shouting, calm down. Who's the driver responsible for the accident? The police officer didn't get angry, but instead tried to comfort me. Your daughter is still here. Please stay calm. I turned my head and saw my daughter's pale face. I sighed in relief and steadied my emotions. Sorry, but who's the driver responsible for the accident? The police officer furrowed her brows slightly. There is no driver at fault. Your wife crashed into a truck carrying steel bars. The truck was parked by the side of the road and wasn't moving at all. How is that possible? I stood up suddenly. The officer continued, after our investigation, we found that the right front tire of your car was punctured, and it was intentional. We suspect someone deliberately deflated the right front tire. My daughter was right next to me, and she could hear everything the officer said. When the officer mentioned it was intentional, I noticed my daughter's shoulders tremble slightly. An idea flashed in my mind. Could it have been my daughter who punctured the tire? It's not easy to puncture a vacuum tire, it requires a lot of force. My daughter is only 8 years old, how could she have that much strength? I looked at the officer. Officer, have you figured out who did this? The officer shook her head. It'll take some time to investigate, but there are a lot of road cameras now. We should be able to trace it. I nodded and tightly grasped her hand. Thank you so much. About 2 hours later, the surgery light went off. A doctor came out of the operating room. I hurried over, my teeth chattering. How's my wife? The doctor smiled. The surgery was very successful. The rod was lodged near a major artery, so it was very dangerous, but it's under control now. With proper care, she has a high chance of recovering. I thudded and knelt on the floor, bowing to the doctor 3 times. The doctor squatted down and helped me up. This is our duty. Let the patient rest for a day, and then you can visit her. Tears began to flow again. I couldn't stop them. My wife is the most important person to me. If I lost her, I truly didn't know how I would live on. I looked through the window at my wife in the operating room. Her face seemed to have calmed down a bit. My daughter pulled me aside. Dad, Mom is okay, right? I crouched down, looked at my daughter's slightly haggard face, and sighed. Don't worry, in some time, Mom will get better. My daughter also shed tears. By the way, Fei, before you got in the car, did you see anyone suspicious? I asked. My daughter shook her head, her brows slightly raised. No, but before we got in the car, Mom insisted that I sit in the front passenger seat. I rubbed my eyes. Didn't you always sit in the back seat before? I don't know why. Mom just told me to sit in the front passenger seat, so I did. My daughter's little face paled again, as if she was scared of something. I stood up and walked toward the officer. Officer, was my daughter sitting in the passenger seat when the accident happened? The officer nodded. Yes, we were also puzzled about why a child would sit in the front passenger seat. Fortunately, the steel bar didn't pierce that seat. I sighed. At least Fei is fine. If anything happened to her, I really wouldn't be able to live on. The officer patted my shoulder. Since you're aware of the situation, I won't stay here any longer. Once your wife is better, you can come to the traffic police station to handle the paperwork. The female police officer handed me a business card with her phone number and address. I nodded. Thank you. Watching the police officer leave, my mind was in chaos. I paid for my wife's hospital fees and waited outside her room. My daughter was yawning and swaying. Adults can handle being in the hospital, but children can't. But today, I couldn't leave. I had to wait until my wife woke up. I found a small mattress from the nurse on duty and let my daughter lie on the nearby chair. She quickly fell asleep. Looking at my daughter's beautiful little face, I fell into deep thought. I sat in the corner and dozed off. The next morning, I opened my eyes to see a female nurse standing before me. Your wife has woken up. I snapped awake. Quick, take me to her. My wife's face was pale, her lips purple, but there was no sign of pain on her face. I'm fine. How's our daughter? My daughter walked over. Mom. I tightly gripped my wife's hand. Rest well, I'll take care of our daughter, don't worry. My wife didn't respond but grabbed our daughter's hand. Fei, are you okay? You scared your mom to death. Despite being severely injured, her first thought was still our daughter. Shenhao, Fei still has to go to school today, take her. My wife coughed a couple of times. I'll stay with you for a while. Tears fell from my eyes. I have a nurse here. My wife looked at the nurse beside her. At my wife's insistence, I had no choice but to take my daughter to school first. When I returned, my wife seemed a bit better. 2 days later, my wife was transferred to a regular ward. I sent my daughter to school every morning, then went to the hospital to stay with my wife. That day, I suddenly remembered what my daughter had said, and asked my wife, why did Fei sit in the front passenger seat the day of the accident? My wife frowned. That day, Fei really wanted to sit in the front, and I couldn't say no, so I let her. My heart sank. There was a contradiction between what my wife and daughter said. I looked into my wife's clear eyes. Why would she lie, especially after being so seriously injured? That meant my daughter might be lying. Fortunately, heaven was watching, and didn't let our daughter get hurt. My wife sighed deeply. Just then, my phone rang. Hello. The voice on the other end said, "This is Shenfei's homeroom teacher, are you her guardian?" "Yes, teacher, what's the matter?" I replied politely. The teacher continued, "Why hasn't Fei come to school the past 2 days? Is she sick?" I was caught off guard. Is that so? Her mother was in a car accident, and our daughter might not have been able to handle it. I lied to the teacher and didn't tell my wife about it. I hired a female caregiver for my wife and rushed home. When I got home, I called loudly, Fei, are you home?" There was no sound from the house. Fei, are you home?" I grabbed my phone and called Fei's children's watch. I heard the sound of the watch ringing. I walked into the master bedroom and saw the watch on the bed. I picked it up, and suddenly, someone hugged me from behind. I froze. "Dad, I miss Mom." It was my daughter's voice. I turned around to see my daughter, and I quickly hugged her. "You scared me. Why didn't you go to school the past 2 days? I miss Mom." My daughter cried. I didn't scold her, since her mom was still in the hospital. I let her rest for now. I took my daughter back to the hospital. My daughter and wife were talking by the bed when the nurse asked me to step outside and explained some care instructions. Just as I was about to go back in, I noticed that my wife seemed to have fallen asleep. And my daughter was pouring something powdery into a water cup. I stopped her. Fei, what are you doing?" Hearing me, my daughter froze. She turned to me and said, "I'm making Mom her favorite orange powder." The powder in the cup turned yellow, looking quite tempting. I let out a sigh of relief. Half an hour later, my wife woke up and was happy to see the orange water made by my daughter. My daughter fed her spoonful by spoonful. Tears welled up in my wife's eyes, but she smiled. That night, I had to go home to care for my daughter, so I didn't stay at the hospital. But the next night, my phone suddenly rang. It was a doctor, speaking urgently. "Mr. Shen, your wife is in critical condition." How could this be? She was fine just yesterday, how could she be so bad in just 2 days? I shouted, "What is happening to my wife?" The doctor didn't answer and hung up the phone. I told my daughter to sleep alone and rushed to the hospital. When I arrived, the doctor told me that my wife was in critical care due to heart failure. I froze in place. After inquiring, I learned that my wife is allergic to mangoes. I knew she had an allergy to mangoes, but she hadn't eaten any mangoes recently. Suddenly, I thought of the cup of water. My daughter had made her a glass of orange juice. Could it be that my daughter poisoned my wife? I found the cup I had used earlier and asked the doctor to check it. The doctor said that fortunately, my wife hadn't consumed much, and after about 2-3 hours, she was out of danger. I stopped doubting myself, and I was certain that my daughter was behind this. I took care of things at the hospital and didn't return home. Instead, I went to the orphanage. My wife has ovulatory dysfunction, so she can't get pregnant. That's why we adopted a girl from the orphanage, who is now Fei. Through the head of the orphanage, I found Fei's file. The file didn't contain much information, but a business card fell out. The head of the orphanage mentioned that Fei had been treated at a mental health institute, but the specifics were unclear. I called the number on the card, but no one answered. My suspicion about Fei was growing. I had installed a few small cameras around the house secretly, thinking that someone might be spying on us. Now, those cameras came in handy. I opened the app and checked the footage from the past few days. In one clip, Fei had taken off her children's clothes and found my wife's stockings and sexy nightgowns from the wardrobe. She put them on and walked back and forth in front of the mirror. In another clip, Fei tried on one of my shirts and suits. It was too big for her, but she still squeezed into it and posed in front of the mirror. In another scene, Fei found my briefcase and looked through the documents at my desk for a long time. Fei is only 8 years old, and I'm a programmer in my 30s. There is no way she could understand those documents. In the video, she wasn't just looking at them, she was taking notes. If Fei were a naturally bad child, I might be able to understand. But why was she going through my work documents? Then, Fei even opened my computer. As far as I knew, her school didn't offer computer classes, and she couldn't use a computer. Yet, in the footage, she was typing on the keyboard like a pro. The camera couldn't quite make out what she was doing. The footage from the past few days was mostly the same Fei either rummaging through things in the house or sitting at the desk, looking through my briefcase. For the rest of the time, she was sitting in front of the computer. This was absolutely not something an 8-year-old should be doing. My wife had always been kind to Fei Fei. Because of my wife's condition, I didn't tell her about my findings. A phone call interrupted my thoughts. The doctor said there were traces of mango in the blanket. I was sure my wife's injuries were related to my daughter. I drove for an hour to the Mental Health Institute, where I was greeted by a balding man in his 40s. I want to check on this girl. I pulled out Fei Fei's file. The balding man glanced at the name, Fei. Please wait a moment, I'll check. He went to the filing cabinet, pulled out a treatment record, and handed it to me. I remember this woman, he said slowly. She had bipolar disorder and mania, but her condition improved before she was discharged. Woman. I stood up in shock. The balding man handed me the record, which showed her age as 42. My mind was in a blur, but my daughter is only 8. The balding man continued, I haven't finished. This woman not only had bipolar disorder, but she also had dwarfism. This is impossible. I staggered back, almost falling to the ground. The man quickly helped me. Sir, I can see you're upset. Do you have a history of mental illness? I shook my head. I don't have a mental illness. I'm here to check on this woman. The balding man stared at me seriously. Sir, your situation seems very much like early symptoms of bipolar disorder. I suggest you get checked. I pulled my arm away from him and shouted, I'm not sick. The balding man's face remained expressionless. Sir, have there been any strange occurrences at home recently? I sat back down, sighing. Our adopted daughter has problems. She actually tried to kill my wife. The balding man shook his head. That's unlikely. Fei's condition was stable when she left the hospital, and she wouldn't be capable of killing someone. But there are some issues in the records. I raised my head. What issues? The balding man frowned. She was sent to our institute after her previous guardian died. I immediately asked, how did that guardian die? The balding man flipped through the files. The guardian was an 83-year-old man and died of natural causes. My head was in a daze, and I felt as though I was caught in a massive conspiracy. Before I left, the balding man stopped me. If there's a problem with that woman, you can bring her here. If she has another episode, we can arrange for hospitalization. I didn't respond, quickly leaving the place. I rushed home, knowing I had to take Fei Fei away as soon as possible. When I got home, the house was dark. I shouted, Fei Fei, are you home? There was no answer. After a whole day without water, I went to the kitchen and grabbed a cup of water, drinking it in one go. Just then, I heard footsteps behind me. Fei Fei stood behind me, her face expressionless. I stared at her, taking 2 steps back. Who are you? Fei Fei twitched her lips. Daddy, did you check my file? I gasped. No matter how you looked at it, Fei Fei was still a little girl, but her voice was deep and rough. Clearly, it was a man's voice. I took another step back. I, an adult, was being intimidated by a little girl. Fei Fei slowly approached me. What did you find? Still, it was a man's voice. At that moment, I felt the world spinning. In the final second before I passed out, I saw Fei Fei give me a gruesome smile. I don't know how long it was after that. A man's voice came through. The anesthesia dose is insufficient. Add 1 more dose. A woman's voice followed. Hurry, he's about to wake up. I felt 2 people moving my hands and feet. I wanted to move my arm, but I couldn't. I tried hard to open my eyes, but could only open a small slit. Through the faint light, I saw a few people in white coats. A sharp pain came from my neck, and I lost consciousness again. I don't know how much time passed. A voice woke me up. My precious, you're awake. I slowly opened my eyes. My head hurt so much, as if it had been split open. The man's voice was familiar, but I couldn't remember where I had heard it before. I opened my eyes wide, and in front of me stood a man. He looked exactly like me. I suddenly opened my eyes wide. Who are you? The man replied, I am you. Har 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 har. I tried to sit up, but my hands and feet were bound. I couldn't move at all. Looking at this me, I shouted, Who are you? Then I suddenly realized, my voice had turned into a woman's voice. I shouted again, what is going on? Myself walked up to me and smiled. A young body is truly wonderful, especially such a perfect and healthy one. Har 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 har. I vaguely realized something. I stared at him. Who are you really? Myself smiled lightly. I'm your daughter. Saying this, he handed me a mirror and held it up to my face. I looked into the mirror and saw an 8-9-year-old girl staring back at me. I opened my mouth wide. I had turned into the appearance of my adopted daughter. "Thank you so much for letting me be reborn." The man stood up straight and bowed to me, his smile growing more intense. Myself continued, "But you should also thank me. If it weren't for me having a conscience, you wouldn't even have the right to stay alive." I shouted, "You bastard! May you die a horrible death." My head began to hurt again, a pain that seeped into my brain. "What did you do to me?" I continued shouting. "Har har, it's very simple. I just swapped my brain with a different body. The old body was really useless." The man also stood in front of the mirror. I learned the truth from his mouth. This man had lived for nearly 150 years through brain transplants. The previous adopted daughter was his third body. His second body had been the 83-year-old man, and after that body aged, he swapped into the girl's body. Then he came to parasitize my family. He originally wanted to stay in the girl's body longer, but the huge rejection forced him to perform the surgery earlier. This man, besides being a pervert, was also a great wealthy man, so he had a medical team working behind the scenes. He leaned close to my ear, "I'm going to pick up my beautiful wife now. I was drooling when I saw you two being intimate earlier. This time, I can finally taste the fishy smell. He he he." I had never felt so disgusting in my life. I yelled, "If you have the guts, let me go, I'll kill you." I struggled on the hospital bed, but to no avail, my hands and feet were firmly tied. Myself said again, "After I've tasted it, I'll film it and show it to you, it'll definitely be exciting, har har." Myself put on a suit, one I recognized it was mine. "This suit fits pretty well," he said, slowly walking out of the room. The next night, he returned. He walked slowly up to me with a big smile on his face, not bad, so white and tender. Saying this, he waved his phone in front of me, "Come see, this is what I just filmed." In the photo, I was sitting next to my wife, and she was smiling sweetly. If you didn't look closely, it was hard to tell the difference. I yelled, "If you have the guts, kill me." He pulled a chair up beside me. "Do you know how much homework I've done? I've been studying your micro-expressions, your movements, the tone of your speech, and even your positions on the bed. Do you know, I even studied Java and Python, but it still needs some practice. But that's not the point, mainly your wife is beautiful, hee hee. To make time to study, I even punctured the tire, so you had to stay in the hospital." He started laughing again. I wanted to kill him, but I couldn't move at all. I calmed myself down. "Can I see my wife again?" Myself patted my head. "What do you think? I went to all this trouble, I'm not playing around. Just once." I softened my tone. He shook his head. "I'm not a savior, I want more than just your body, I want your whole life." Har har har. Laughing, myself coldly added, "Enjoy your time now, you won't last long. This body doesn't match your brain, the rejection will probably start on the third day." I continued pleading, "Just let me see her once, I only need to look from afar." After multiple pleas, myself finally agreed. My wife shook her head, looking puzzled. "The daughter is already asleep, there's no one outside." Through the glass window, I finally saw my wife again. She was leaning on a cane, and I was supporting her. My heart was bleeding, but I could only watch, as several people were watching me too. Suddenly, I saw myself start coughing up blood. The people around panicked, calling for help, and I saw a few people in white coats rush over and carry him away. In the phone calls around me, I heard words like "rejection reaction suddenly worsened" and "brain hemorrhage." Seeing this, I gave a cold smile. Indeed, my body was very healthy, but a few days ago, I felt a severe headache. I secretly had an examination and found out I had a brain tumor, though it was small and hard to detect. Come on, let us go to hell together. End of story. Please like, comment, and support. Thank you so much.